Well, good evening, and welcome to this edition of our Wednesday night study in the Gospel of Mark. I'm Pastor Scott Harris, pastor of the First United Methodist Church in Eustis. And this is a regular weekly study that we have been doing now for, I think, 10 weeks. And we've gotten all the way to almost the end of chapter 2. So we've been moving, a little bit slow. But I do want to say that if you're a first-time viewer of this study, that you don't have to feel as though you're too far behind, because all of the lessons that we have done to this point are available on the church Facebook page at First United Methodist Church Eustis, or on our church webpage with the same address, First United Methodist Church Eustis. And you can catch up with the various lessons and be right here along with us. And I will say too that each lesson is sort of independent, and you can pretty well jump in and out as you like, because we're going over various passages. We'll look at a passage, and then we'll go on to the next passage and the next passage, and we're taking a hard look at what these various passages have to say to us, but also what do they mean in the time in which Jesus spoke them. What was the context behind the words that Jesus spoke, or the actions that Jesus took? Because context is so very important for us to be able to understand how we can apply it to our own situation today, some 2,000 years later. So I'm glad that you're here with us. If you're new, we're grateful for your presence, and we invite you to continue to watch and participate. You can, and like I say, you can catch up with us by going to the church Facebook page and web page, and you can see the postings of the previous lessons. Just a reminder, just a word of review again. John Mark was the writer of this gospel, the Gospel of Mark, and we believe that John Mark was the son of a rather well-to-do woman in Jerusalem who was a follower of Jesus and had a rather large home there in Jerusalem, which scholars believe was the place where the Last Supper was held. And after the death and resurrection and the ascension of Jesus and the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, her home becomes the center of the Jerusalem church. And this was the center where the original disciples, that was sort of their headquarters, and they would move out to their various mission responsibilities from that location, from Jerusalem. And it was the brother of Jesus, whose name was James, who really becomes the head of the church there in Jerusalem, along with Simon Peter. And we know that John Mark, the author of this gospel, had a close connection with Simon Peter, so much so that the belief is among the scholars that the gospel is actually the preaching material of Simon Peter that Mark recorded. I mean, you don't have any better eyewitness to the events in Jesus' life than Simon Peter. And that's how we have this great gospel, this wonderful gospel, which is believed to be a first-hand account from the mouth of one of the great apostles of the church. And in the previous weeks, in the early parts of the first chapter, now into the second chapter, we see how Jesus has felt the call. He's left, his work in Nazareth, where he basically took over and was the leader of the family after probably a premature death by Joseph. And now that he's out, he's going forward with his mission to share the good news, this gospel that he came to bring, and he's called his disciples, and he is beginning to do the work. And right from the beginning, he is encountering some opposition, some people who are not quite sure about him, not quite sure about this message that he is giving. And we're going to be seeing this now in the verses that we're going to be looking at this evening, where he is confronting the scribes and the Pharisees, who are really just are watching him to see if he's somebody that can be trusted with the people. And so we're gonna read about that tonight. We're in the second chapter. We're going to begin with the 23rd verse, but before we begin, let's have a prayer. Lord, be present with us now as we enter into this time of study together. How grateful we are for every opportunity to be teachable, to be able to have our minds stretched as we look at your word as it comes to us through this great gospel. And we pray that as we listen and as we absorb the insights that are being shared tonight, that the special word, the special insight that you would have us to garner will come clearly into focus and find a place in our heart. For we pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, we're going to begin now with the 23rd verse of the second chapter. One Sabbath, underscore that, one Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions. And then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." I do want to say, before I really begin to get into this, that early translations of the Bible, especially what we know of as the Old King James Version, and some of those older translations use the term corn there, that he's traveling through a cornfield. And what I want you to understand is that if your translation happens to say that, understand that was not corn like the maize that the Pilgrims ate with the Indians on the first Thanksgiving here in America. You know, like a lot of words, that word has changed in meaning over the centuries. And the word corn back in the Old King James time was a word that actually meant grain. It was a term that incorporated all of the grains like wheat and barley and oats and so on. And so if you ever come across a translation where it talks about corn, don't go say, wait a minute, they didn't have corn in those days. It really is a translation that should be interpreted as the word grains. So once again here, we see Jesus, who has just cuts right across the scriptural rules and regulations. When he and his disciples were going through this this field, this grain field on one Sabbath day. That's important, Sabbath, circle that. His disciples began to pluck some grains of this, some peak parts of this grain, some heads of this grain, and began to eat them. Now, this was absolutely okay for them to do. It was absolutely fully permitted in the Pentateuch and the first 5 books of the Bible, which made up the Torah, the law of the Jews. Actually, in Deuteronomy 23, verse 25, you will see that this was a part of it. And you have to understand, one of the things that we really need to appreciate about our Jewish ancestors is that they had this tremendous sense, first of all, of hospitality. They welcomed people. They needed to look out after people, which is something that they did. If you were a stranger and you came into town, nobody knew what you had been through. Nobody knew the struggles that you had encountered along your journey. And so it was the obligation of the people in that town, that community, to take care of you, to provide an open house, to provide something to eat and something to drink, and even a place to lay your head. This sense of hospitality was very, very important. And this sense of taking care of the weak and the hurting and the helpless was also a part of who they were as a people. In their law, it was required of them for a farmer not to harvest the entire crop. They weren't allowed to harvest the entire crop. They were to leave a certain part of the field open so that the widows and the orphans and those who just didn't make enough to make ends meet could go and they could handpick. As long as they didn't put a sickle to it, then they were all right. They could go and they could pick it so that they would have something to eat. So they had this real heart and compassion for those who were less fortunate. And it was written into the religious law. Now, the disciples, as I said, were doing something that was absolutely permitted for them to do, except they were doing this on the Sabbath. And the Sabbath has around it all of these other rules and, regulations and restrictions, and, it all had to do with the commandment about not, keeping the Sabbath holy and, not doing any work on the Sabbath. Well, what was work? What was considered work? And it was the lawyers, the legal people, the scribes, and the Pharisees who began to define out the things that you could do and the things that you couldn't do on the Sabbath. They had 39 categories about work. 39 categories about work. Doesn't it? It sounds like a bunch of lawyers, doesn't it? You take a simple commandment, don't work, and you have these lawyers taking a look at it, and the next thing you know, you got all kinds of categories about it. And of those 39 categories, 4 of these were reaping, things that had to do with reaping and winnowing and threshing and preparing a meal. And take a look at these disciples. What are they doing? What they are doing could absolutely be categorized under all 4 of them. And so the Pharisees and the scribes see Jesus' disciples out there, plucking and reaping and winnowing and whatever to get this grain, to have this grain to eat, and they are labeled lawbreakers. They are lawbreakers. They're rule breakers. And it seems fantastic to us. But you have to understand that to the people in those days, this was considered a deadly sin when you went against Sabbath law and Sabbath rule. And, this was life and death to them. It was that important to them. And so the Pharisees immediately launch out at Jesus. I mean, they immediately make an accusation about what's going on, and they point to the disciples and points out how it was that they were breaking the law. And obviously, they expected Jesus to do something about this, But then, Jesus doesn't always do what we expect him to do. At least he didn't do what the scribes and the Pharisees expected him to do. Instead, Jesus throws this back at them in their own language. He cited the story from 1 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 6. 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6. When David is fleeing for his life. Okay, let's stop there. Why was David fleeing for his life? Do you remember the story? Poor David, he was a great king, and he was loved by God. He was God's man. But David was not always, his life wasn't always what it should be. And his being a father, he had all these kids, these sons, and sometimes they weren't very good. He had a son named Absalom, who was a handsome young man who believed that his father was not a very good king. And so he felt that his father needed to be replaced, mainly because, his father wouldn't avenge what was considered to be the rape of one of his sisters. And so Absalom is going out there and he's politicking. He's out among the people and he's got the big grin. He's out to win an election. Except this isn't going to be an election. This is going to be a coup. And Absalom decides that he's going to rebel against his father, throw his father off of the throne, and he gets this support. He gets this army to support him. And so David has to flee for his life because of his own son. Because his own son had betrayed him. Life was not always good. I have a series of sermons on David that maybe I'm going to preach this summer because he is such an interesting character, and his life has so much to teach us about life. And so you can be looking forward to that in the summer months. But David is fleeing for his life, and he ends up coming to the place called Nob, the tabernacle in this little township called Nob. Now, the tabernacle was the portable dwelling place of God. I mean, they took the tabernacle with them in all of their journeys, and they would set it up. It had the tent of the tent of the Holy of Holies and the presence and everything like that. And inside that was this holy place. And there was this golden table, and on this golden table, they put bread. They put 12 loaves of bread. This was called the bread of the presence, or the showbread. And the belief behind the showbread was that place, that spot, was where God dwelled. God was there. And this bread was there in case God was hungry, basically. They wanted to have this offering there out of thanksgiving for all that God did. And so they had this offering of this bread, these 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and the great thanks and gratitude they had for God's guidance and presence and mercy for them along their journey. Well, this bread was only supposed to be eaten by the priest. What it would be there for 7 days. And at the end of the Sabbath, they would change it out, and they would put out 12 more loaves, and it would stay there until the next Sabbath, the end of the next Sabbath. And David comes to this tabernacle, and he is starved. He doesn't have any food, and David knows that showbread is there, and he says to the priest, he says, "Give me some food." I'm hungry. Give me some food. And they said, well, we don't have any food. We don't have any food. And so David goes in and he takes the showbread. He takes the showbread for himself. And he eats it and he gives it to his men to eat as well, the ones who were with him. And so Jesus was showing to these scribes and Pharisees that Scripture itself supplies an example in which human need took precedence over human and divine law. That human need, meeting the hunger of these people, was far more important than the law, the divine law, the ritual law, the human law that had been devised, these rules and regulations. And then he says this, the Sabbath was made for the sake of humanity, for men and women, and not men and women for the sake of the Sabbath. And that was self-evident. Humanity was created first. Humanity was created, from the very beginning. It was the Sabbath that came later. And then it was the scribes and the Pharisees who then began to add all these rules and regulations about how you're supposed to observe the Sabbath, the do's and the don'ts, and what you can be and what you can't be on it. And all of these the rules started out to be good because they were supposed to make the Sabbath fuller and better for human beings, for men and women. But people began to be enslaved by the rules of the Sabbath. The Sabbath exists to make life better, but they had turned it into a ball and chain. And so Jesus comes out and says to them, that the Sabbath is for man, not man for the Sabbath. Now, this passage confronts us with some essential truths that we better not forget. First of all, this, and that is that religion, my beloved, does not consist in rules and regulations. Sunday observance is important, but there's a great more to religion than just Sunday observance. Whenever we forget that love and forgiveness and service and mercy are at the heart of religion, and instead we try to replace that by the rules and the regulations of going to church, you can't do this, you can't do that, the don'ts, then religion is in decline. Christianity has at all times consisted far more in doing things rather than refraining from doing things. And then this, the first claim on any person is the claim of human need. The claim of human need. You need to look out after others even before, you worry about worship and being there at worship. Let me tell you a story. When I was in my first year at Asbury there in Maitland, where I ended up serving 13 years before I retired, in the first year that I was there, Peggy, I woke up one Sunday and Peggy was having these chest pains. And I was concerned about her because she doesn't complain very much at all. And so when she is complaining, something is not right. Something is going wrong. And I was concerned about her, and I asked her, well, should I stay home? Because church was going to be starting in about an hour and a half, and I always got there at least an hour and a half before the service began. And I said, are you all right for me to go? Do you need me to stay home? Because I'll gladly stay home. She said, no, you go. I'll be okay. Well, I went. Early service began at 8:15. And just as I'm getting ready to walk up to the platform to just getting ready to begin the service. All of a sudden, one of the ushers comes to me and he says, Scott, you need to leave. You need to get to the hospital because an ambulance is taking Peggy to the hospital. Well, it was a good thing I had an associate, and it was a good thing that I had him scheduled to preach the middle service because he had a sermon ready. And I turned to him and I said, this is all yours. I'm out of here. And I left and I went to the hospital. But that's not the point. The point is that in that service was a pulmonologist who was a member of our church, a cardiologist who was a member of our church, as well as a retired thoracic surgeon. All three of them showed up at the emergency room. All three of them. These doctors, they came in, and the pulmonologist, who became a really dear friend. Well, all three of them became very, very dear and close friends. That pulmonologist walked into that emergency room like he owned the place, and he almost did, because he was very well known in all of the Florida hospital system there. He was an outstanding diagnostic person, and he just walked in and said, this is my patient. Well, she wasn't really his patient because we hadn't established, but she was his patient from that point on. But the point is, they left worship because human need was more important than going through the ritual, going through the process of being there. They were doing worship by doing God's work, by assisting somebody in need. I want to tell you something, my beloved. Simple things. If you're going to church on Sunday morning, you're heading into church, and I know we have to be very careful in these days, but if for example, if you saw a person on the side of the road, say it was an older woman, an elderly woman, she's got something wrong with her car, and perhaps she's one of those that doesn't have a cell phone, you wouldn't pass her by. If you passed her by, then you'd be like the priest or the Levite in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Well, no, you would stop and you would help that individual. And I would expect that of you, that has first claim on your life. The first claim on all of our lives is human need. And Jesus is making this point. Going to make this point in the next story I'm going to tell you in particular. And then the best use of sacred things is to use them to help people. That, in fact, is the only way we can give sacred things over to God. There's a beautiful story that goes along with the story of the wise men coming, making the trip at the birth of Jesus to offer their gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But there's this tradition that there was a fourth wise man, and his name was Artaban, and he had a gift he was going to bring, and the gift consisted of a sapphire, a ruby, and a pearl beyond price that he was going to give to the king, the newborn king that the star was indicating had been born. And he goes, and all four of them were going to meet. They had designated a spot where they would meet, and then together they would sort of go by caravan to follow this star wherever it was going to lead. But on the way to the meeting place, Artaban sees someone on the ground before him. And this was a traveler who was stricken with a fever. And he stops. And he stayed with that traveler and helped him, provided food and water until his fever broke, until he was better and able to walk. Sort of like the parable of the Good Samaritan. Well, that meant now that Artaban had missed, connecting up with the other three wise men. And now he was going to have to go all his own, and he was going to need hire camels and bearers, and to make this trip across the desert, because he had missed the caravan that was going on before him. So he had to sell the sapphire. He had to sell the sapphire in order to purchase the things that he was going to need, so he could make the journey to see the king. So because he helped this man, he ended up having to use one of the gifts. And he was saddened that the king would never get the opportunity to use this gem. And he journeyed to Bethlehem, but he was too late. Mary and Joseph and the child had already left for Egypt, having been warned about the fact that Herod was going to kill all of the children. And he comes at that time when Herod's troops are there in Bethlehem, and they are beginning the slaughter of the innocents. They are beginning to kill the babies one by one by one. And he's in the home of a woman who has a young son. And the captain of a guard comes with a troop of soldiers, and here he stands in the doorway. He's a big figure. He's tall and dark, and with the ruby in his hand, he takes it and he bribes the commander to leave that house alone and to spare that child. And so now Artaban was without that gift to be able to give to the king, and because of that, the king would never have use of it. Well, years went by. He continued to wander. He continued to look for this king, and he knew that as the years passed, that this king was probably growing, and he was hoping that one day he would encounter him. And finally, after about 30 years, he travels to Jerusalem, and he hears about a crucifixion that is taking place, and he heard about this Christ, this Jesus who was being crucified. And he sounded wondrous, like he was the king. And so Artaban hurried towards Calvary, maybe with the pearl. Maybe with the pearl he could somehow buy the life of this king. But as he's making his way there, down through the street comes this young girl, and she's screaming, she's fleeing a band of soldiers. "My father is in debt," she cried out, "and they're going to take me and sell me as a slave to pay the debt. Save me." And Artaban hesitated, and finally he took the pearl out of his pocket and gave it to the soldiers, and he bought the girl's freedom. And all of a sudden, the skies turned dark, and there was an earthquake. And in this earthquake, a tile from one of the roof hit Artaban upside of the head and knocked him to the ground. And there he lay, half conscious. The young girl places his head in her lap. And suddenly his lips begin to move in this semi-conscious state. And he said, "Not so, my Lord, for when did I see you hungry and feed you? When did I see you thirsty and give you a drink? When did I see you a stranger and look for you? Or naked and clothed you? When did I see you sick in prison and come to you? 33 years have I looked for you, but I have never seen your face, nor ministered to you, my King." And then in a distant, faraway voice, there came the voice, "Verily I say unto you, insomuch as you did it unto the least of these, you did it unto me." And Artaban smiled as death overcame him, because he knew that the king had received the gifts. The best way to use the sacred gifts that we have is to use them for others, to use them for people. I've known churches that have sadly tried to block off places where they didn't want children to come. They churches that had these wonderful, special things, traditional things, ancient and sacred things that were very important to the church, but they didn't want children around them or near them. But the sacred things are only truly sacred when they're used for others. The Sabbath was never more sacred as when it was used to help those who needed help. And the final arbitrator of all of those things, my beloved, is love, not law. Well, we finally made it to the 3rd chapter. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. And they watched him to see whether or not he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, he said, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger, and he was grieved at their hardness of heart. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. My beloved, this is a crucial moment in the life of Jesus. It's already clear that he and the Orthodox leaders of the Jews were quite at odds with each other. And for him to go back into that synagogue was a really brave thing to do. It was the act of a man who refused to seek safety and who was determined to look a dangerous situation in the face. In the synagogue, there was this group of members from the Sanhedrin. Now, for those of you who have been watching the Bible study, I've talked to you about the Sanhedrin before. This is the ruling group, but we may have some new people who are joining us. And the Sanhedrin was this ruling group in Jerusalem, made up of 70 men. And these were made up of Sadducees and Pharisees and scribes and elders, important people. This was the aristocracy. These were wealthy people who kind of governed. They were allowed to govern the religious life of the people. And they had the responsibility to make sure that, no riots or revolts broke out anywhere else in the country. That's why they became concerned whenever they would see somebody who was attracting a large crowd of people. They would go and try to find out what was going on there and try to nip it in the bud, because they didn't want these things to get out of hand and people to start crying for a Messiah, and to start a revolt that would end up in the death, when Rome would come in and crush it, would end up in the death of a lot of people. And so the Sanhedrin was used to sending out these representatives whenever somebody was attracting a lot of attention in the crowd, to find out why. Was this somebody on the level? Was this somebody who was teaching orthodox truth? Or was this somebody who was stirring up the people and somehow trying to declare themselves as a Messiah, and thus possibly create a revolt that would only mean death to all of those involved, and it would threaten the position of the Sanhedrin, because they're supposed to keep peace. The Romans, more than anything, wanted peace there. They wanted calm. They didn't want any riots. They didn't want any revolts. They didn't want to have to put down, any any kinds of actions against the authority of the empire. And so that's why it was important for the Sanhedrin to send these people out to check on the orthodoxy. So here you have, look at this. They're in the synagogue, and you have this group of scribes and Pharisees from the Sanhedrin. And they're sitting in the places of honor, because in the synagogue, the seats up towards the front were always the place where the people of notoriety, of importance, would always sit. And they would always take those seats because they were important. And plus their egos needed to be fed because they were important. And they were there, now get this, they were there in that synagogue, not to worship, not to possibly learn something, but to criticize and to find charges to bring against this man Jesus. I hate to say it, but I have pastored for 45 years, and I've pastored some churches where I've seen people who would come to church. They weren't there to worship. They were there to find just about everything that was wrong that they could find. And they'd go home, and instead of having fried chicken for lunch, they'd have fried preacher for lunch. Not that ever happened to me. I just heard about it from my other preacher friends. But I know it took place, because I did have to deal with some individuals who just really didn't understand the concept of being there in a spirit of expectation, ready for the very presence of God to dawn upon them and perhaps transform them from the bitterness that they contained in their hearts. Just like these Pharisees and scribes were there with this bitterness and suspicion in their hearts, and if they had just simply listened to what Jesus had to say, then perhaps they too could have been transformed and found real life. Real life. In the synagogue was a man who had a paralyzed hand. Now, the Greek word that is used here for this paralysis is interpreted as this was a paralysis that came later in life. This was not something he was born with. This was a paralysis that probably came with a disease, an illness that caused this paralysis. And in the Gospel of the Hebrews, and the fragments of we have, this story in the language of that particular, we have an indication that this man was a stonemason. So we have a real tragedy here. This man, he's got the tragedy of a withered hand, but he's got the tragedy too of a lost livelihood. He can't take care of his family because he can't work with his hand in this condition. He can't do the thing that he is trained to do. And this is a man who was ashamed to beg. He was not going to hold out the good hand and beg for people to give him enough money to survive. Now Jesus could have been cautious and prudent here. All he had to do was say to this man, well, it's at sundown, when the Sabbath is over, you can come and see me, and I will heal. I will heal your hand. But let's wait until the Sabbath is over. But that would go against all that Jesus believed in terms of meeting human need right where it was, in the moment that he confronted it. I mean, the law, forbid him for doing this. It was considered work. Yes, it was considered work to heal on the Sabbath. The Jewish law was definite about this. Medical attention could not be given unless a person's life was in danger. Let me give you some examples. A woman in childbirth, you can help her. An infection of the throat, I don't know why that was so, but you could help somebody with that. If a wall fell down on top of you, they could dig you out, but if you were alive, they could also help you on the Sabbath. But if you were dead, your body just had to stay there until after the Sabbath was over. You couldn't put cold water on a strain of the hand or the foot. You couldn't, if you cut your finger, you could put a bandage on it, but it had to be a plain bandage, and you couldn't put any salve ointment on it. In other words, this is all to say that at most, an injury could be kept from getting worse, but it must not get better. It was against the Sabbath rules because it was work. You couldn't do good in their eyes because it was work. Those doctors who came to Peggy there in the emergency room, when she was taken by ambulance there, when they heard about it, they left worship and went to see her to check on. They wouldn't be able to do that. It's against the Sabbath rules. And now this may be very difficult for us to understand, but you have to. I think we can best see it in the light that the strict view of the Sabbath, the Orthodox view. In that strict Orthodox view, remember that the Jew would not even defend himself on the Sabbath. In the days of the wars of the Maccabees, the Maccabees revolted against the Seleucids, which were the Greeks, who had conquered the Persians. The Persians had conquered the Babylonians. This was it was Babylonians, it was Persians, it was the Greeks. Those were the ones who basically had rule over Palestine, for centuries. But for 100 years, the Maccabees were able to they defeated the Greeks, and 100 years they had self-rule in Israel. 100 years self-rule until the Romans came along, and of course everything changed after that. But during the revolt of the Maccabees, there's Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that several of the Jewish fighters had sought refuge in some caves from Syrian troops. Syrians were fighting with the Seleucids, and the Seleucids, the Syrians offered to let them come out, offered to let them surrender, but they wouldn't. And they knew that the Jews would not fight them on the Sabbath. And so they waited until the Sabbath, and then they go in, they set those caves on fire. The Jews in that cave, they did nothing to stop up the entrances of the cave or to protect themselves. They would not defend themselves against the attack. They would not do anything to disrespect the honor of the Sabbath. It was breaking the law, and that was a life or death thing for them as well. We saw this with Pompey when Pompey invaded Israel, the Roman general, to basically destroy Rome. I mean, Rome had had enough of the rebellion of the Jews, and they finally just decided to tear Jerusalem into pieces. And they built a ramp that overlooked the temple area there because so many people had retreated to that area. And they built a ramp so that they could throw down boulders, they could bombard them from this high ground. And they wouldn't, whenever they were building it, they would always build it on the Sabbath because they knew that the Jews wouldn't do anything to try to stop it, even though the Jews knew by letting them build that ramp they were sealing their own deaths. The Orthodox Jewish attitude to the Sabbath was completely rigid and unbending. It's hard for us to understand that kind of attitude. But we have some people who can be pretty rigid and can be pretty unbending. We face that in the church even today. There's no sense of being able to let's talk through this. Let's come to an understanding with one another. So Jesus knew this, and he knew that this man's life wasn't in danger. and physically he would be no worse off if Jesus just waited until the next day to heal him, if Jesus waited until the Sabbath was over, when it wasn't against the law to heal him. But Jesus calls him up, calls him forward. And I think there was two reasons for that. I think he called the man forward, first of all, in the hopes of trying to elicit some sympathy from these very rigid rule holders. It's trying somehow to have, maybe they would have some sense of pity and mercy and compassion in their hearts when they saw the man in this state in which he found himself. Maybe it was also so that they would see, everybody could see exactly what he was going to do for this man, but they didn't have any mercy. So Jesus asked the lawmakers there two questions. He said, is it lawful to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath? Well, they couldn't deny that, you can't admit that it's not lawful to do good. Yes, it's important to do good on this Sabbath. And this was a good thing that Jesus was proposing to do, and so they were bound to deny that it was wrong to do evil on the Sabbath, and the evil would be not to help this man. And then he asked them, is it lawful to save a life or kill it? Because what he was driving home here was he was going to take steps to help this wretched man's life, while they were thinking about ways to kill him. And so, on any reckoning, it was surely a better thing to be thinking about to help this man than it was think about killing a man. And so it's no wonder they said nothing there. And then Jesus spoke the word, and the man was healed. And it said the Pharisees went out and tried to hatch a plot with the Herodians to kill him, which is kind of interesting because the Herodians were sort of the entourage of Herod Agrippa, who was ruling that province of northern Galilee, where Capernaum was located. And they did a lot of dealings with the Gentiles, with the Romans. And no Pharisee would have anything to do with a Gentile. Absolutely not. Made them unpure to do with that. But they compromised their own principles. And we're dealing with these unclean individuals, these Herodians. They formed this unholy alliance because of the hate that was in their heart, which would stop at nothing to get rid of Jesus. It points out two differences between the Pharisees and Jesus' religion. The Pharisees, it was all about ritual. Their religion was all about, keeping certain rules and regulations. It's like when a person believes that if I go to church, if I take the sacrament, if I read the scripture, if I do devotion in the morning, if I pray, and I look religious, I'm okay. But then if I go out and cuss when I'm driving, and when I cheat people, who I'm doing business with, if all of the ritual stuff doesn't translate in the transformation of your heart, then you don't have religion at all, because religion is all about transformation. And for Jesus, religion was service, and that service was to love God and to love people. Ritual was irrelevant compared to love in action. Well, I think I have used all my time. Thank you for tuning in to this study of Mark, and we'll continue it next week from where we left off, but at least we're into chapter 3 now. And I want to thank you again for your ongoing support of the church. Thank you for that. We are so grateful for all that you're doing. And be sure to stay tuned to this weekend. And I want to remind you that we are doing communion together at this service. We're going to, at the very end of the service, I'm going to lead us into a time of the sacraments. So I'm asking you, if you're planning on watching the service, no matter whether it's Saturday night or Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon, morning or evening, or at 2 o'clock in the morning sometime, be sure that you have the elements available to be able to take the communion with us. Just a cup and a piece of bread. And I know that maybe you don't have grape juice because of everything, but some kind of juice will do. You know, even if it's water, we'll turn the water into wine, or at least we'll pray that God will help us to think that it's water that's been turned into wine. So grateful for all of you staying tuned and being so faithful to this study. God bless you, and I'll see you this weekend.